and growth that give rise to forms. In his notebooks, the painter Paul Klee repeatedly insisted, and demonstrated by example, that the processes of genesis and growth that give rise to forms in the world we inhabit are more important than the forms themselves. Form is the end, death, he wrote. Form giving is movement, action. Form giving is life. And this in turn lay at the heart of his celebrated creative credo of 1920. Art does not reproduce the visible, but makes visible. It does not, in other words, seek to replicate finished forms that are already settled, whether as images in the mind or objects in the world. It seeks rather to join with those very forces that bring form into being. Thus the line grows from a point that has been set in motion, just as the plant grows from its seed. And taking their cue from Klee, philosophers Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari argue that the essential relation in a world of life is not between matter and form, or between substance and attributes, but between materials and forces. It's about the way in which materials of all sorts, with various and variable properties, are enlivened by the forces of the cosmos, how they mix and meld with one another in the generation of things. And what Deleuze and Guattari seek to overcome in their rhetoric is the lingering influence of a way of thinking about things and about how they are made and used that's been around in the Western world for the past 2 millennia and more. And it goes back to Aristotle. To create an object, Aristotle argued, you have to bring together form, morphe, and matter, hyle. And in the subsequent history of Western thought, this so-called hylomorphic model of creation became ever more deeply embedded. But it also became increasingly unbalanced. Form came to be seen as actively imposed by an agent with a particular end or goal in mind, while matter was thus rendered passive and inert, that which was imposed upon. So my critical argument in this lecture is that contemporary discussions in fields ranging from anthropology and archaeology to art history and material culture studies continue to reproduce the underlying assumptions of the hylomorphic model, even as they seek to restore the balance between its terms. But my ultimate aim is more radical. With Deleuze and Guattari, it's to overthrow the model itself and to replace it with an ontology that assigns primacy to the processes of formation as against their final products, and to the flows and transmutations of materials as against the states of matter. Form, to recall Klee's words, is death. Form giving is life. So my purpose, in short, is to restore to life a world that has been effectively killed off in the pronouncements of theorists for whom, in the words of one of their more prominent spokespersons, namely Daniel Miller, the road to understanding and empathy lies in the study of what people do with objects. Now, my argument has 5 components, each of which corresponds to a key word in my title. First, I want to insist that the inhabited world is comprised not of objects, but of things. So I have, therefore, to establish a very clear distinction, at least for the purposes of my argument, between things and objects. Secondly, I'll establish what I mean by life as the generative capacity of that encompassing field of forces and materials within which forms emerge and are held in place. I'm going to argue that the current emphasis in much of the literature on material agency is a consequence of the reduction of things to objects and their consequent falling out from the processes of life. Indeed, the more that theorists have to say about agency, the less they seem to have to say about life. And I would like to put that emphasis in reverse. Thirdly, then, I'll claim that a focus on life processes requires us to attend not to materiality as such, but to the fluxes and flows of materials. We're obliged, as Deleuze and Guattari say, to follow these flows, tracing the paths of form generation wherever they might lead. Fourth, then, I shall determine the specific sense in which movement along these paths is creative. That is to read creativity forwards as an improvisatory joining in with formative processes, rather than backwards as an abduction from a finished object to an intention in the mind of an agent. And then finally, I'll show that the pathways or trajectories along which improvisatory practice unfolds are not connections, nor do they describe the relations between one thing and another. They're rather the lines along which things continually come into being. So when I speak of the entanglement of things, I mean this literally and precisely, not as a network of connections, but as a meshwork of interwoven lines of growth and movement. So, sitting alone in my study as I prepare this lecture, it might seem obvious that I'm surrounded by objects of all sorts, from the chair and desk that support my body and my work, to the pad on which I write, the pen in my hand, and the spectacles balanced on my nose. But imagine for a moment that every object in the room were magically to vanish, to leave only the bare floor, walls, and ceiling. Short of standing or pacing the floorboards, I could do nothing. A room devoid of objects, we might reasonably conclude, is virtually uninhabitable. In order to make it ready for any kind of activity, it has to be furnished. As the psychologist James Gibson argued, introducing his ecological approach to visual perception, the furnishings of a room comprise the affordances that enable residents to conduct their routine activities there. The chair affords sitting, the pen writing, the spectacles seeing, and so on. But rather more controversially, Gibson extended his reasoning from the interior space of the room to the environment in general. He asks us to imagine an open environment. He says, a layout consisting of the surface of the earth alone. Now, in the limiting case, that is, in the absence of any objects whatsoever, such an environment would be realized as a perfectly level desert with the cloudless sky above and the solid earth beneath, stretching out in all directions to the great circle of the horizon. And what a desolate place that would be. The surface of the earth affords nothing but standing and walking. That we can do anything else besides depends on the fact that in all ordinary circumstances, the open environment, like the interior room, is cluttered with objects. The furniture of the earth, writes Gibson, like the furnishings of a room, is what makes it livable. So, let's now leave the seclusion of the study and take a walk outside in the open air. Our path takes us through a woodland thicket. Surrounded on all sides by trunks and branches, the environment certainly seems cluttered. But is it cluttered with objects? Suppose that we focus our attention on a particular tree. There it is, rooted in the earth, trunk rising up, branches splayed out, swaying in the wind, with or without buds or leaves, depending on the season. Is the tree, then, an object? And if so, how do we define it? What is tree and what is not tree? Where does the tree end and the rest of the world begin? Now, these questions are not easily answered. Not as easily, at least, as they are for the items of furniture in my study. Is the bark, for example, part of the tree? And if I break a piece of bark off in my hand and observe it closely, I'll doubtless find that it's inhabited by a great many tiny creatures that have burrowed beneath it and made their homes there. So are they part of the tree? And what of the algae that grow on the outer surface of the trunk, or the lichens that hang from the branches? Moreover, if we've decided that bark-boring insects belong as much to the tree as does the bark itself, then there seems no particular reason to exclude its other inhabitants, including the bird that builds its nest there and the squirrel for whom it offers a labyrinth of ladders and springboards. And if we consider, too, that the character of this particular tree